Hello and welcome to altPOV.radio. Today our guest is Ruben Uriarte, Ruben actually is a veteran UFO researcher and member of MUFON. He is a field investigator, state director for MUFON for Northern California, and deputy director of investigations and internal affairs for the Northern California MUFON. MUFON, of course, stands for Mutual UFO Network. Ruben has been involved, again, he's been doing this for a while, and he's been involved with a large network of research organizations. He served as California State Coordinator for Crop Circle Phenomena Research International and was a former research director for Beyond Boundaries, a company specializing in taking tour groups to various UFO hotspots around the world. Ruben also currently serves as a board member for OPUS, which stands for Organization for Paranormal and Support Understanding. He's shared his expertise in this field on various local and national radio shows and TV documentaries, and he's been on the Discovery Channel, Learning Channel, History Channel, including UFO Hunters, Ancient Aliens, and the travel channels How UFOs Crashed My Vacation, and also the Science Channel's Unexplained Files. Ruben, also being a dedicated researcher in his documentation, has authored a number of books. He co-writes these books with Texas UFO researcher Noah Torres, and if I mispronounce that, he'll correct me, but Noah Torres? Noe Torres. And really the books focus on major UFO crashes that have occurred along the border of the southwestern United States and Mexico, and also on some other historical cases. And Ruben, welcome to the show, first and foremost.
Hey, Jack. Thank you for having me on the program.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on. I really do appreciate that. Tell us a little bit, and again, you've done extensive work in this field. It's not easy to write one book, and you've written several. So tell us how did you get started in this?
Well, Jack, it all begins when I was a kid. I had my first sighting. Maybe I was 8 or 9, 10. I can't recall exactly the age, but I was just a young kid. I was in a schoolyard between my apartment where I lived and a library, and there was a playground there. And I remember seeing something very strange. It looked like a balloon. That's how I thought. But what caught me, what I thought was really weird, was that the balloon never moved. It just stayed there, and I kept looking at it, and something about it just really changed me. I don't know how, but it just seemed to give me this strange sensation that I was being watched, actually. And so I forgot about it, and then I believe the next day or several days later, my friends and I were playing in that same area, in that same playground. And I remember back then they used to have these big cement tubes that you could crawl in like a tunnel and out, and I was jumping off one of them. And then as soon as I did that, I saw my friend looking up. He says, "Hey, look, a flying saucer." And I looked up. I didn't see it, but I can remember the expression of his face. And I remember, and then all of a sudden, what happened was it took me back to what I saw, that balloon or that object that was just hovering there. And this was back in the late 50s. And that had a profound effect on me later on, Jack, because that remained with me. And then, of course, I had several other experiences, other sightings. When later on, I'll share with you when in England, I was with, as you mentioned earlier, I was with a group called Beyond Boundaries, which was a tour group that specialized taking people to UFO hotspots around the world. And all that was synchronicity, how I hooked up to them. But I had my good friend, my friends who have passed away, Joyce and Pike Murphy. They ran a tour company out of Rainbow, Texas, and they've had a lot of experience. And she had her own tour agency, and she created this one just to focalize on who specialize on paranormal and UFO expeditions. So when I became when I heard about her show, when I heard about her expedition, I signed up immediately. And when I did that, we went to England, and that was my very first crop circle expedition back in 1994. And when we were there, that's when I had an encounter with these strange balls of light, and it was awesome. It was just a total awesome experience, Jack. In fact, the Travel Channel did a segment of that experience called "How UFOs Crashed My Vacation," and so they reenacted that great experience that I had. So that changed my life, actually, being a part of Beyond Boundaries, because it enabled me to go to different parts of the world, crop circle expeditions, to different countries, networking with a number of other researchers. So when I listened to different speakers at different conferences, I already knew what they were talking about because I've been in those areas and was very familiar with a lot of the different research based on the people that I met. I was really very grateful to have met so many wonderful people. And I think, Jack, what I really found in traveling is that this phenomena, of course, it's a worldwide phenomena, and it affects people in so many different ways, but there seems to be a common string, and that is that many of these people do recognize that there's something extraordinary that's happening, and at the same time, it's already has already had an impact on their lives, and it just seems like family. Whenever I go to across the state or meet somebody, just that we have something very common to share, in spite of the differences in culture or language. It just seems to be a bond there.
It's almost like a universal truth.
Yeah.
In a way, and I think a lot of people forget that when they talk about UFOs and alien abductions, they tend to focus on the phenomena themselves, right? So they forget that people are having these experiences. They're experiencing these things. Some are less benign, others are a lot more intense. But regardless of that, you have this profound experience that changes your life, and it affects people. And I like to say it's really part of the human condition, is that we have these paranormal experiences. But I'm glad you said that, because I often feel the same way. It's like, no matter who you meet, where they're from, Australia, you can speak different language, not really communicate well in English, but it's again a universal language. This happened, and this is what I felt, and like, well, that happened here too, and you're not alone, and this happens here, and it happens there, and cultures are completely different. So, but the same thing's happening.
Yes, exactly.
So it's very interesting. So when you, over the years, do you start to kind of put pieces of a puzzle together? Do you kind of, as you start to do all of these things and you travel, and you might go to do a crop circle investigation and meet some interesting researchers and have that experience that you had, which sounds incredible, and then you're doing something else on an animal mutilation, or you're doing something on a UFO crash site or something like that. How do you, as a researcher, I almost look at it as like there's this big board in front of you, and there's these missing pieces, and you have all these different pieces that you're kind of trying to put together. How do you organize that in your brain, and how do you come up with, for even personally, for you to come up with, what are we dealing with here?
That's a really good question, and the reason why I'm chuckling is because every time I get on an airplane or I'm going somewhere and I just have to look back and I say, what the hell did I get myself into? And because I look out the window, and as the airplane's departing the airport and we're flying up, and I'm just thinking, I just said, well, I'm wondering what this next adventure is going to lead me to, and that's how I look at it. It's always an adventure for me. Certainly, I may have written down plans or who we're going to see, who we're going to touch, or who we're going to get in contact with and get in touch with. And one of the things that I have always been fascinated with is how the synchronicity, how you connect with somebody and all of a sudden there's some other group of people that totally opens up more of the investigation, or you go to a location, and I always I keep that open. And so with that, it's just been the wealth of information that we've been able to gather. And as you mentioned earlier, I've had the really good fortune of working with my friend and co-author Noe Torres, which we've co-authored a number of books together, and we do have a website called RoswellBooks.com. And what's interesting is that Noe's background, he's a baseball historian.
Oh, wow.
And he's written several books on baseball and some of the baseball legends from the past. A lot of people that aren't aware that baseball was just a really big deal in Texas and across the border, and goes way back. It's a universal game. And with that, he also had an interest in the paranormal, and then so. One day, I was involved in a project with the History Channel, Jack, and because of my travels to Mexico, I got in contact with the History Channel. Contacted me, known as the UFO Files. Actually, was part of that series, and they were doing a whole series on Roswell type crashes, UFO crashes. They did one in Texas, they did one in Australia, they did a variety of countries. And the one that I did, which I was a part of, was the one that happened in a case that was known as the Koyame UFO crash that occurred back in 1974. Actually, that marks 40 years since that event happened back in August 25th, where a small object was being tracked out of the Gulf of Mexico, flying into U.S. airspace, and then it avoided. It flew in a different direction. It flew over Mexican territory, over the airspace of Mexico, and this object was being tracked as it was going in a northwest direction, and it collided with a small airplane that departed out of El Paso. And the reason why we know so much about this case was it's based on a document known as the Deneb Report, where back in the early 90s, an anonymous group of people released this document to a number of UFO researchers back in the 90s, describing in detail exactly what happened in the crash retrieval of this case. So when the History Channel, they did a reenactment of the Koyame incident. Noe happened to be watching that program, and then he got in touch with me. He got in touch with several other researchers beside me, but none of them really responded to his email. And I saw it, and I responded to Noe, and and Noe and I began conversing. And all of a sudden, he said, Ruben, I've always been interested on doing cases relating to Texas UFO paranormal, but how about collaborating? Let's do a book together. So with that, we called it Mexico's Roswell. We kept the same title. Jack, see what happens? I respond to an email,
right,
and it just opened the doors. It could have been anybody else, but no one didn't take that opportunity, and I did. And
right.
I responded to Noe, and then Noe said, "Hey, let's work together." We just hit it off together as fellow researchers, and obviously, I love the guy as a brother. We worked together on a number of other book projects, To our amazement, Jack, as we began doing the research of the Koyame incident, we started gathering a number of other cases of crash retrievals that also have occurred along the southwest border between Mexico and the United States. And originally, when we put our first book together, it was like 3 major cases in one book. But then we realized, I said, we had so much on each case, let's just make it 3 separate books. So we did the case on the 1974 crash of Koyame. We came out with actually 3 books. The first and second edition, known as Mexico's Roswell, and then we came up with this book here called the Koyame Incident, which was our latest book, and with a number of witness testimony in this particular book that I can share with you in a little bit. We also came up with another book. This happened back in 1955, called The Other Roswell. And this case here, called UFO Crash on the Texas-Mexico border, this case involved a fighter pilot who is still alive today. Back in 1955, was flying a mission with a group where his group of fighter F-86s were escorting group of B-47 bombers. There was a number of exercises being done during the Cold War, and these guys would fly escort, and this one UFO came across their flight path, and he saw this thing making a tight turn and then going down toward the Mexican side of the border, and he followed it with he had permission to follow it, and he saw it crash. And so he later went back to the crash site, which is a whole other story in itself, of Colonel Robert Willingham. And we had another case that we did back in 1948 called Falling Angel, which is about a UFO crash that also occurred on the Mexican side of the border back in 1948 near Laredo, Texas. A fascinating story as well. So we began putting these crashes together. I mean, these books about crashes together, and from there we've had other book projects as well. But in my travels, Jack, I've come across some really little fascinating stories. Some that I don't have a chance to really share with radio audience, but I would like to really share it with your group, with your audience.
That would be great, and I want to get back to as well some with the crash sites. I want to ask you a quick question about that. What patterns do you see in these quote unquote UFO crashes, as far as because I've read some books and I'm excited to read your books. I find stories about that fascinating because, first of all, it's very tangible, right? It's a tangible event. Something crashes, so there's either trace evidence or there are eyewitnesses, and there's usually some kind of attempt to cover it up before anyone even sees it. So I wanted to ask you, and you don't have to get into details, and we could get into details of each one, but in general, do you find that the cases, you have some eyewitnesses, you have people who happen to be, I would say, at the right place at the right time. Sometimes it's the wrong place at the wrong time. But is there always a quick, very quick government intervention, or is it sometimes there's time to actually see and witness without that interference and without getting thrown out of the area? What have you ascertained regarding that?
Well, the connection that we've been able to see in the various cases, and there are still more, by the way, that we're just finding out, not just along the border of Mexico, but also in the interior as well. And I think regionally is one of the fascinations that I have is that we have so many concentrations of UFO crashes along the Southwest. Don't know why specifically. I mean, we could theorize that maybe they were shot down, or the ET flight mechanisms were were interfered with, or the or they're bad drivers and they crash. But
it's a tough stretch tough
yeah,
stretch of highway there.
I mean, you hear so much how advanced these guys could be, and all of a sudden they come to the Southwest and crash your vehicle. But it's an amazing. That's because he had the Roswell crash in 1947, and it just what's interesting is that that's not that far from the crash site that occurred in near Koyame, which is real close to Presidio, Texas. The other one was near Del Rio, Texas, the one in 1955, and then you have the other one real close to Laredo, Texas, which is further south. But what's interesting is those three cases that I just shared with you happened to right within on the Mexican side of the border. And the other aspect of this is we see a relationship between how quickly the United States or the American intervene and will go to the crash site and recover as much as possible the crash or any of the occupants, if there are any. And also there seems to be a relationship between the Mexican government or the military, which is true today, and CIA connections as well. And what's interesting is that we are getting some very interesting witnesses that are sharing their particular points of view that may have an actual connection to the case. And what I find very interesting, Jack, is that these cases aren't cut and dry. They're not solved. Seems like the more we get into it, and if we're able to share our this case on the radio, there might be someone listening to your show, for example, that say, "Oh, I remember this. I remember my father saying something," or I remember, I saw that. I saw them on TV. Yes. And it'll go back, and we'll get a phone call or an email. And in fact, that's how in our last book, the Koyame incident, we were able to get some very key witnesses, which tells us something very, very extraordinary had happened in that area. So I forgot to mention too, Jack, as a result of all this, both Noe and I have been working with a number of city officials along the border in putting on UFO conferences based on the crash. So we're having like based on Roswell, New Mexico, we are now having festivals based on the UFO crash, which in turn is excellent because that brings us more interesting, possibly more interesting people, or that may have possibly have been a witness to that event.
And with these witnesses, Ruben, real quickly, and we're a grassroots show, and the people who listen to this already know this. Sometimes we have mic problems. I'm hearing a little feedback on your mic. I don't know whether it's almost like wind, or I don't know whether or not maybe hitting your shirt, the wire. I don't know. I'm not sure. It seems like
I turn off the fan. I think that might be it.
That was it. Oh my gosh, right. That's perfect. Yeah, I just started hearing it a couple minutes ago. Thank you. Appreciate that. A couple other, so, you talk about the witnesses, okay? Reluctant to come forward. I know everyone's different. And I know sometimes it does take people talking about it, and then all of a sudden it's like, you know what? Yeah, I was there. And they're finally, maybe they're at a certain age. It happened 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and they're finally like, you know what? Was there a lot of intimidation? We know in Roswell there was a lot of intimidation. There was a lot of effort put forth to scare the heck out of every witness in that situation. Do you get that in these other cases, or are they more remote? Or not that Roswell wasn't remote, but again, patterns there?
Well, I think that, for example, the case of the Koyame incident, there were several key witnesses that we shared in the book, and let me start out with this. the Mexico Roswell was on Wikipedia. And so you can go look up Mexico's Roswell, and you can go to the Wikipedia, and Noe had initially was able to put in the general information, what it was, all the facts, da da da. Someone went in there and added names, Jack. They started adding the names of the American military personnel that were involved in the crash retrieval. Then they added names of the Mexican soldiers that were also involved, that died during that time. Supposedly the Mexican soldiers were exposed to some sort of biological or chemical or radiation cause because they weren't wearing protective suits, and when they picked up the airplane crash, they also were picking up. They picked up the saucer, put it on the flatbed truck. When the U.S. spy satellites and reconnaissance aircraft flew over, they noticed that all these soldiers, the Mexican soldiers, were laying on the ground. Which later a retrieval team out of Fort Bliss, 4 helicopters flew into Mexican airspace. They flew to the crash site, and they retrieved the flying saucer. And these guys were wearing protective suits. Again, all this is in that DENIP report. So we used that DENIP report, and we kept going into detail. And Noe's from Texas, and he knows the geography. He said, these people really know the whole geography behind this case. So with that, when we developed the book, and then later we started putting on these conferences, there was one interest, and because someone had anonymously posted the names of these people, we felt, this might be an insight. I mean, there might be another possibility, whether this is a hoax or not a hoax, but we're still in the process of evaluating those names. The fact that someone would go into specific detail, give us the name of, or even the type of airplane that had collided with the disc. Noe did try to to contact the source. He did some great detective work, but the source was very avoided answering any of the questions that Noe was asking, and finally just cut off communication with us. So I believe it's still posted. I need to go back if one is interested, but those names are, we included that in our last book, the Koyama incident. The other is go ahead, Jack.
No, I find it fascinating that, and we've seen that a little bit now, where certain members of these, and again I say quote unquote, crash retrieval teams are coming forward, right? And they're saying, I was on one of those crash retrieval teams. And to me, I think there's a lot of smoking guns with the UFO phenomenon. I really do. But I think this is one of the most amazing ones, one of the more compelling ones, is that these men were actually assigned, for whatever reason, their training or whatnot, to these crash retrieval units, and still are. I mean, this is continuing. This is ongoing. So what was going on in the 40s is still going on today. And I remember I read a book a while ago about the Brazilian UFO crash, that famous Brazilian UFO crash, and they call it the Brazilian Roswell because it was. But I remember some people got sick. One of the witnesses or something died because he was exposed, again, to either radiation or something from the crash. And I just, again, Brazil, Mexico, Japan, wherever it might be, New Mexico, you have a lot of the same elements, a lot of the same things happening. And has anyone, and this doesn't happen a lot, I'm not suggesting it does, but has anyone come forward to you yet to say, hey, I was part of a crash retrieval team? You mentioned that one gentleman, but then they get, they back off. Sometimes they get really scared, or they might get a phone call to say you're not talking to anyone. Has that has that happened a lot, or not at all? Or we
do get people that were connected with the military back in Fort Bliss, right around that time, and they do share with us that there was a lot of unusual activity that was going on at the base during that time. Or so we're of course that's a big flag for us, and we immediately would want to find out from them what they could share with us, and they are hesitant. In fact, there might be another possible lead very shortly. But, the part of the issue is that this happened almost 40 years ago, and some of these gentlemen are already up in age and dealing with health issues or dealing with. So we're hoping that we could catch them at the right time. It's just like the case that I mentioned back with Colonel Willingham. He's in his late 80s now, and that happened in 1955. And so when we interviewed him about 5-6 years ago, he had a series of health issues, and so he tried to recollect as much as possible what had happened to him back then. But the guy's sharp as a whip.
That's good.
Going back to that case of Brazil, this is really interesting. Here's a connection. In our book, The Koyami Incident, there's a police officer. He's now retired with the LAPD. I had heard him on Coast. I was listening to Coast to Coast, and it was they had Richard Dolan on, and then this gentleman called in and started to share his experience when he was a kid down in Koyami. And he started explaining that one day his family, he has family in Koyami, Chihuahua, and that during the summer they would go visit their grandparents that had a ranch. So he said that he was about 12 years old at the time. He said that he was riding his grandfather's horse, and he was in that area just riding around, and then it was getting very dark, so he came back and dismounted and started getting the horse attended to, and he heard this strange noise. And he looked across the road, and there was this field of corn. And he heard something coming through, talking, was walking toward him, and he thought, so he noticed the horse kind of perked up as well. So he's looking, and lo and behold, he sees, at first he thought it was an animal, but when he looked again, he saw this small being. And he looked at it, and he noticed that this thing had red eyes. And it was just staring at him. And then he also noticed that in front of the head, it had these small little, almost like horns, and it's almost like a devil, but they were protruding from its forehead, on top of its head. And he said when he saw that, he ran. He just freaked out, and he had shared with us. Later, we were able to get into contact with him, and he went in detail. And he said that he ran to his uncle and to his father and his grandmother, and he was in shock, telling him what he saw. And his grandmother said a very, very interesting remark. She said, "Oh, you must have seen the little diablitos, the little devils." And so, yeah, because she said they would see them out there. Both her and her husband would see these strange creatures out in that area. Coincidentally, that happened in August of 1974, which the Denham report had indicated that the UFO crash had occurred on August 25th. And our witness says that he was there in August of 1974. And what's very interesting, he said that when he saw the History Channel do that particular documentary on the case of Brazil, he saw the description of the beings, and he said, "Oh," he says, "that's exactly what I saw." Whoa.
Talk about corroborative evidence, right? I mean, that, yeah, exactly. So again, logically, objectively, are these the particular species, I say species, extraterrestrial intelligences that are happen to be doing whatever they're doing in this area of the world during this time, during this time period? And yeah, that is exactly right, because I remember in the book in Brazil, that's exactly what they look like. And of course, then though, you always have the issue of cultural biases. So obviously, people are going to go off on the devil on that one, red eyes and horns. So even if they are extraterrestrial beings, most people are going to see something like that and be like, the devil, and so it's hard to kind of, how it is with witnesses. You have to say, well, objectively, what did you see? Just explain what you saw. Don't say it was the devil. Say this is what it looked like, but it could have been a creature, a small little guy from another planet that just happened to have red eyes. Again, it's all conjecture, but you know what I mean? But yeah, no, that's incredible. That really is. I mean, he must have been seeing something like that has to be terrifying.
Oh yeah, and he's been with the police department for more than nearing 30 years. He's a very experienced police officer, so he knew
great witness.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And at the same time, when he said he saw that, we also work very closely with a number of other Mexican investigation groups in Chihuahua and other parts of the country. So during my time, I've had the opportunity to network and meet a lot of great people. I mean, they do fantastic work. It's just that we don't know too much about it, about what they do, but there are some really well-known researchers in Mexico and Latin America that do fantastic work that I work closely with them even through my role with MUFON. I work in international affairs, and I work very closely with a number of our other MUFON officials where we're working with MUFON chapters as well. But yeah, when he mentioned that, and then I got a case, another gentleman had shared me an investigation of a witness that also saw the same type of creature or the same type of being in Chihuahua. And what that gentleman didn't realize is that I also already had the testimony from the police officer. But the investigator was sharing the statement of what the witness observed, and he said, yes, a small creature with red eyes, with little stalks on its head, and it makes you wonder how prevalent they are, if they are the same species that we might be encountering in other parts of the world.
Right. That's fascinating. Really interesting stuff. We taped this show, and we're taping the show. It happens to be 9/11 today.
Yeah.
And it is obviously a horrible day in not only American history, but in general, just a terrible, terrible day. You were involved in an investigation in Mexico in the 1990s.
Yes.
And please talk about that a little bit. It relates to, there's a suggestion there that it relates to 9/11. And again, this happened in the 1990s. Can you tell our listeners about that?
Yes. Actually, we do have a segment of this in our book, Mexico's Roswell. But Jack, I just find it fascinating. I mean, the fact that we're dealing with the sad anniversary of this day, but it's also changed the direction of our world in many respects. With the current national, international situation. A really good fortune, again, sharing with you that I was able to visit a number of UFO hotspots in Mexico, and was able to connect with a number of Mexican investigators and eyewitnesses. And I had the good fortune of becoming researcher or research guide, a scout for the Beyond Boundaries. And we took a group of people in 1995 to Mexico, and we went to the volcano, which is Mount Popocatepetl, and it's one of the largest active volcanoes in Mexico. It's very close to Mexico City and to the city of Puebla, and it's a Popocatepetl. It's an ancient Aztec Nahuatl name, and Popo means smoke, and Tepetl means smoky mountain. So that's where that word, the word. It's an ancient, it's an old Aztec name, Smoky Mountain or Popocatepetl. So I heard about a gentleman or a young man that had an encounter with 3 small beings and near the volcano, and unfortunately I wasn't able to meet with him until we went back in 1996, and we met with these several contactees at this little town called Atlimayaya, which it's real famous for its trout fisheries. And there's a lot of great restaurants there. You wouldn't expect to see trout and fish, but sure enough, I mean, they have all these great trout fisheries there. And I had a chance to meet with this young man, and I sat down with him, and he began talking about what had happened to him, about this encounter that he had with these strange beings. And he said that in 1993, both he and his friend, they were herding a bunch of goats, basically, and that the boys were sitting along a rock ledge, and suddenly there was a bright, intense light, and that frightened the goats, and the goats became very frightened, and the goats formed a protective circle. So the young boys are noticing the behavior of the goats, how they were bunching up together. And then when they looked, they noticed that they saw these 3 beings, these 3 small beings with large heads, and they were wearing this very tight clothing. And he noticed that their faces was very strange too, and either they didn't have any mouths or he just couldn't see, but he noticed that they had big eyes. And Claudio described one of the beings as having a small beard. That caught my attention. A small little quill-like chin hairs on. And he said that that being started to speak to both him and his friend telepathically. So the being was talking to Claudio, and Claudio said that he could hear this garbled voice inside his head. And then the bearded being said that they were there to protect the volcano from erupting, and they were there to prevent the others from erupting the volcano. What's interesting about that, Jack, is that I've talked to a number of other people that live in that region, and they believe so much that the volcano is like a portal. I mean, we still get reports today of strange objects that are flying in and out of the crater, and a lot of number of reports of strange UFO sightings in that area. So Claudio said he heard this garbled voice, and so the being was sharing that they were there they were like guardians, basically. And in that telepathic link, he told Claudio that there would be a future event that, and Claudio was very puzzled, and he asked what. And the bearded being said that there will be a war in New York that would cause the entire world to go on alert. This was in 1993. Okay. And I went in, and then I interviewed Claudio in 1996. I have the audio cassette. I have pictures. There's a picture that I sent you of me sitting down with him and a friend of mine who's also an investigator. And Claudio's sharing the story. So he told Claudio that would put the entire world on alert, and that there would be a war in New York. And Claudio really had very limited education. In fact, one of the contactees there who we met was the owner of one of the restaurants, and he told me, Claudio has very limited education. If you showed a map of the United States, Claudio will not be able to tell you where New York is. So I thought, wow, that's really fascinating. So when I interviewed him, and this is the mistake I made, Jack, when he mentioned that there would be a war in New York, and then again Claudio had this interaction with these beings in 1993, I had thought to myself, Claudio must be referring to the first World Trade Center attack that occurred in 1993. So then I shifted my focus more on what these beings looked like, what were they wearing and all that. Because I made a mistake of making that judgment, and that's something I've learned. Don't make judgments, go back and get as much information. But again, this was in 1996, and then there was a television show. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. Back then, it was a paranormal television show known as Strange Universe. Mm-hmm. And it only aired from September 9th of 1996 through January of 1997. So they only had a couple of months that they were aired, but they did a show called the Mexico Files, or the Mex Files, where they would go to and do a couple of different shows on what the UFO phenomenon in Mexico. So they went and they interviewed Claudio, and Claudio would shared the same story and the strange prophecy. And this was 1997, that there will be a war in New York. And fortunately I have that segment. I have the actual television show. But later, of course, we had the World Trade Center attack back in 2001, September 11th. And after that, my assessment totally changed. I said, my assessment of this mysterious prophecy that was delivered to Claudio was what it did, it raised questions. For me, I thought, well, were these beings really foretelling the destruction of the World Trade Center? That was what was going to happen in September 11, 2001. So here we are now, 2014, and I always I've heard of other encounters, other people that have been given prophecies or some sort of different message based on their encounter. And I thought, this is something that it's really profound because it does have obviously big major relevance to what's occurring today. I mean, is it possible that these ETs had some sort of inclination that something was going to happen? If so, how did they know? Raises so many questions.
Right.
And why Claudio? Why Claudio? Why was he given that information?
Right.
And the other thing,
No, go ahead.
Oh, just to finish off with Claudio, he did have. He said that they did have some object flew over to their home, and there was a light beam that was being emitted down to their house, and that his parents, all the kids, his brothers and sisters were very frightened, and then the object left. And of course, I heard that from a number of other witnesses as well. I have not had a chance, or I hope someday to meet with Claudio, to see how much this experience has changed his life, and see if there's any other messages or anything else that may have given to him. Who knows? But I think I wanted to share this story with you in relevance to today, what's occurring as 9/11.
Wow. And again, just to reiterate, he has this experience in 1993. You interview him in 1995.
96, actually.
96.
I heard about him In '95, yes, when I went down there and went back and then.
Okay, and he's telling you about something. Now, when he told you this, he didn't know the date, the year. He just said that they told him something was going to happen. Were they going to try to prevent it, or they just told him it was going to happen?
Just what they told him, that there would be a war in New York that would cause the entire world to go on alert.
And of course, you're right, because that brings up a whole lot more questions than answers. Because now you're talking about, are they time travelers? How could they know this? And if they did know that, they're trying to prevent the volcano from erupting. And I found it interesting that they also said the others were going to erupt it. So what did you gather from that?
That to me, there's was one gentleman that believes that there might be a group of malevolent beings that may want to create a disaster and harm humanity, in one sense or the other. And in that part of the world, especially in Mexico, you have a number of volcanoes, and you have a number of other earthquake faults and other possibilities. And what I found quite interesting over the years, and especially we just recently, Noe and I had worked on a book project called UFOs over Mexico, Encounters with Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, and that's all about pilot encounters. The book was actually authored by Carlos Guzman and Alfonso Salazar in Spanish, and what Noe and I did was we worked with them and translated this book into English. And the thing that really got me very aware was the amount of UFO encounters that pilots were having after earthquakes, and whether or not there's a connection, I'm not sure. That's something to take a look at.
Right.
But the fact that that was also something that, and these pilots were, they're professional airline pilots, and so they were describing their events and their experiences. So going back to Claudio, and some of the real other, I have a number of other little interesting stories to share that normally I don't get a chance to talk about on a radio show, and so this is just one of them.
Great. No, and that's and I want you to share. These are great stories, and I wanted to ask you something about Mexico in general before we get to that. The last time I spoke to, I had to go down to Miami. I met with Jaime Musan regarding something we were working on, and I asked him. I said, wow, the things that are going on in Mexico are keeping you very busy, because he had mentioned that. He's like, the tip of the iceberg. There's so much going on in Mexico that you hear that there's a lot going on in Mexico, but even that is the tip of the iceberg of the reports that are coming in from very credible witnesses. And, obviously all of us have seen the mass sightings over Mexico City where hundreds and thousands of people are seeing these strange lights in the sky. The Mexico City airport where they're having all these encounters. People are having close encounters, but also obviously crashes. And sometimes we don't hear about these things. Sometimes it takes years to hear about them. Do you have a theory on Mexico? Obviously you've done a lot of research in and around Mexico. Why Mexico? And I know that's a very nebulous question, because who knows? No one really. What are the answers to any of this, right? But do you have any theories on why perhaps it is such a hot spot? Is it culture? Is it people being more open to talk about it?
It's all the above, Jack. Obviously it's happening in other parts of the world, and I think a lot has to do with the media. The fact that there are journalists like Mr. Jaime Maussan that has his own a very good television show called Tercer Milenio, where he airs the phenomena to the Mexican public. And what I find fascinating too is there's a number of other radio shows and television programs that have also expanded, and we've had a chance to meet with all these various journalists as well and other researchers. So they are bringing in a number of information. Now, I can't say, I mean, even though we're getting a lot of media focus in Mexico, we have a lot going on here in the United States as well. And I shared with you that I also am a member with MUFON. We have a database and we keep track. It's just that most of our cases that we receive are obviously from the United States, but we're coming close to over 60,000, 70,000 cases within the last 10 years that we developed our case management system. Can you still hear me? I'm hearing like a little static in the background.
I can hear you, but it might be the mic. On my end, it'll go away in about 30 seconds, but this might be the time that it happens.
Okay. But and then of course, the culture, the fact that there's been so many other civilizations, various groups, and I think for me personally, the smoking gun is going to be definitely coming from another country. I mean, obviously we have so much very good evidence and testimonies from a number of witnesses here in the United States, but the fact that now with the improvement in technology and some really interesting research, Jack, that maybe I might hopefully be able to share down the road. I really think that Mexico has its own uniqueness in terms of ufology and may be part of that whole smoking gun that you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, it seems that way. It seems that, and like you said, perhaps the government down there, and governments also in other countries, some of them at least, tend to be more open about revealing some of the things that are going on. So I almost feel like the United States is really they're the ones that are preventing disclosure more than anything else.
There is a campaign right now that's trying to work in trying to get the Mexican government to open their files. Totally different, of course, than where you have Chile and other parts of Latin American countries that are actually opening their files and actually working with their local groups. Mexico, I feel, is partly that's maybe because of it's right next to the United States, and of course we have a lot of major interests there, and just so happens CIA headquarters is Mexico City, and just so happens that we also have a lot of other major agencies in Mexico City and other parts of Mexico. So I think that's just part of the issue that we may have. So it's not as open as people tend to say because there's still issues. But I think the efforts that many of these researchers are doing down there hopefully may open up more information for us to share.
Yeah, good. Well, we hope that that's the case. You mentioned another fascinating case. Was that also in Mexico that you wanted to share, or was that somewhere else?
Oh, I think there's you just had Mr. Chuck Zukowski on your radio show, and I had a chance to meet Chuck on the Unexplained Files. We did the same shooting together, or film shooting, on a really interesting case. It just was aired several weeks ago on the mysterious deaths of elk that was occurring in New Mexico. And Chuck is a animal mutilation expert, as you know, and also an excellent researcher. And in this particular episode, there were hundreds of elks that were dying, and they just really couldn't find out the explanation as to why, what was causing the deaths. And it all slowly, the episode was leading toward the possibility that could the deaths of these animals be related to extraterrestrials? So was there an extraterrestrial connection? And Chuck had interviewed a number of ranchers that did see UFOs over their property, and then later the next day they would find either a cow or bull or something that was mutilated. Whether we didn't find any elk that were actually mutilated per se, but I was involved in a case with Washington State MUFON, and there was a report that they had received where there were approximately 14 Hispanic workers that were working up in the remote mountains of Washington, near the Oregon border, close to Mount St. Helen, actually, the volcano that had exploded back in the 80s. And these guys were basically planting seedlings. That was their job. After they cut down the trees, they go back and they start, putting in small seeds that would then grow into, large trees that would then be reused by the timber company. Well, these gentlemen were working one day, and several of them observed this object that was flying close to them, and there was a small elk herd that was very close by. And one of the witnesses said he went up to his pickup truck to grab his lunch bag and turned around and was looking at the elk down below, down the slope, and then he looked and he saw this strange object, small object, was tilting left and right, tilting left and right, left and right. And the object would change from red to white, and then all of a sudden it went toward the elk herd, and then the elk just started to run in different directions. And there was this one lone elk that started running away from the rest of the herd, and this object went and grabbed it, or picked it up, took the elk over a row of trees, and as it was picking up the elk, there was a tree branch that hit the elk. The elk started to drop. The object flew down before the elk hit the ground, picked it up, and took it straight up into the sky. And these guys were very frightened. So much frightened that they told the management, and it was the management of the timber company that contacted Washington State MUFON. And the reason why I got involved was because they needed help in terms of translation. These guys spoke very limited English, so they had asked me if I would be able to serve as a translator, and I said absolutely. And so I had a chance to be a part of that investigation. What these gentlemen were telling us, we interviewed the ones who actually saw the object. We spoke with them separately, and then we interviewed each one of them independently. And the guys were saying, hell, if this thing could take an elk, these elk, they can grow they're about 500 pounds up to 1,000, large bull elk go way up to 1,000 pounds. They're huge. And these guys were saying, hey, if this object could take an elk, what's going to prevent that object to pick us up, take a pickup truck with us somewhere.
Right.
And so we met with them, and they were these gentlemen. They weren't making the story up. I mean, they had nothing to gain, and at the same time, they were saying that they were getting somewhat ridiculed from their friends and family, for sharing the story or talking about it. Oh, you guys were drinking. Oh, you guys were under influence of marijuana. Oh, they were basically making fun of these guys and condemning them.
Right.
They didn't feel good about it. So I happened to we interviewed them. We had them on tape, and I met this one witness that was the main guy. He saw it all happen and described what this object looked like. It was small. I don't know if you're familiar with the sitting stools in the laboratory, in a lab, in a science lab. It had the shape of that kind of a seat. It's very strange. But the fact that this thing flew silently, and when it picked up the elk, it was as lengthwise as long as the elk. It was small, but there was nothing grabbing the elk. It was as it was picked up, and as the object would tilt, so would the elk. But there was nothing touching the elk at all. Almost, we're saying it could have been a force beam, but how else?
Right. Right.
It was levitated, or it was picked up. So the elk was taken up into the sky, and it never came back. And so we went to the location, and we did a report on the case. It was fascinating. There were some people who had thought that it could have been a paraglide or a parachute, and there's just absolutely no way, Jack. I mean, that area is so remote, in the fact that was possible. Some people had felt that was the reason or the explanation, but these guys, they saw this at different angles. So years later,
right. Plus, how could a parachute grab an elk with an invisible force? So basically, just to verify, the object was really not much bigger or as big as the elk itself, and
yes,
was probably just a transport vehicle or something to take the elk to, I hate to say mothership, but a larger craft or something.
Could be, yeah.
Or maybe. I mean, but it's interesting that it was that small.
Yes. Some speculated it was a drone. I said, well, could a drone do that? I mean, this is back in 1999, when these gentlemen had that experience. And so there was another witness that who saw the object, a supervisor who saw the object several weeks later. And to my knowledge, what it was told to me was that the supervisor was told not to say anything and to keep it under wraps. And I'm hoping that this television show that was just shown, that this gentleman may see it and hopefully may get in contact with us, or hopefully I could find out and make contact, because his testimony would be extremely important. And who knows what's going on up in the mountains there, Jack?
Right.
Other people may be having other strange sightings of these strange objects. Who knows what they are? But the way the description was, to me, it felt like it was a mechanical.
Right.
It wasn't an animal of some sort. Although there's a legends of the thunderbird up in that area, large birds that may be coming down for its prey.
It's interesting what Mount St. Helens, and you mentioned the mountain, and I'm going to try to pronounce it. I want to try to pronounce this. Mount Popocatepetl?
Pretty close, Popocatepetl.
Popocatepetl. Yeah, see, you say it so smoothly. You spent time in Mexico. I have not yet. Okay, and that's the last time that mountain in Mexico, that volcano in Mexico, as I'm going to refer to it. When people talk about, well, it's a portal. There's a lot of spiritual significance in majestic mountains. I think of Mount Shasta is the same exact thing. When you have these UFO sightings, you have these strange creatures and events, these things that are seen in and around Mount Shasta as well.
Yes.
And I mentioned this with Chuck, and I mention it always comes up because we're all researching this. We're talking about the same types of phenomena. There's so much going on. And what I mean by that is, here you're talking about something, at least their eyewitness account is it's shaped like a laboratory chair seat. And in fact, it's a very small, not as big as the elk, no bigger. All right, and yet it's somehow carrying the elk away into the sky. So you have that. Then you have these strange creatures that are seen, whether they have red eyes, horns, whether they look like chupacabra, whether they look like Bigfoot, whether they look like, because Chuck's done a lot of work in the San Luis Valley, and we all know about the San Luis Valley. Tons of different types of strange phenomena and different creatures and different types of UFOs. So you have all of these things happening, and it makes you, I think, again, it just makes it harder to theorize as to, you do collect a lot of evidence as a researcher. Whether that body of evidence equates into proof is another story, right? And certainly depending on who you talk to, right? As scientific communities, no. I guess my question to you is, when you're involved directly in these cases and you're traveling to these locations, I mean, you're there, different parts of the world, different countries. How do you categorize all of these different types of strange phenomena?
Good question.
And I guess because we like to fit things into neat categories. So what I tend to want to do, like I just did, that must have been one of their just a craft to get it up to the ship to do the experiments on, right? Because that makes sense. It would be like, well, they send down these little drones or these little, little craft to grab the animal and then take it up to the actual craft where their scientists are up there removing their eye sockets and removing their uteruses and removing, doing all the things that are typical of animal mutilations. No one thinks, but we can't rule out the fact that maybe this is something completely different than that.
Yes. Totally.
I don't want to do that because then it confuses me more. They didn't see that happen, right? They just saw it being lifted.
Yes, and the supervisor of the working crew was a little reluctant. He wanted to get these guys back to work. The other guys who didn't see the object thought it was a mountain lion attack. That's why it was frightened of the elk. But the main gentleman who saw it all, and then several of the other guys that were next to him, they seen this object, the way it behaved. All that evidence, all their testimony was extremely valuable because we have something there. We have the documentation, and the fact that I was totally surprised that the Unexplained Files were interested in this case, but then later when I started to realize that they were also investigating a different angle, what was happening in New Mexico that involved Chuck and his investigation, then I realized that, yes, I see what they're doing, and see where it leads up to this whole story that I just shared with you in the audience.
And what was that angle? What was the New Mexico angle?
Oh, the angle again, they were trying to find out what could have caused the strange deaths. They had a biologist there, and they ruled out it wasn't anthrax, it wasn't this particular virus, it wasn't this. The fact that it just focused on the elk, and as of today, they really don't know what killed the elk. Of course, the connection with the extraterrestrial was where I was involved in my investigation with the Washington State MUFON investigators, where we were interviewing these witnesses who actually saw an object that took away one of the elks.
Mm. It would have been ideal if they could have gotten a photo of that, but of course.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that would be ideal, but they were probably just, you never know when these things are going to occur. So what I wanted to ask you something also about the crash sites. Have you ever been able to obtain any physical evidence, not you personally, but maybe run into a witness who took something, like in Roswell, some of the witnesses supposedly took some of the objects or some of the metal that from the crash site? Or is it usually the case where they're whisked out of there so quickly they don't have a chance to, or it's confiscated, or does anyone talk about the physical trace evidence, or is it usually gone by the time there there was never an opportunity to obtain any of that.
Yeah, that it's a good question, and what we found in the cases that we investigated, and also in another case that another book that we wrote, Aliens in the Forest, where a gentleman had a deer hunter had an encounter with these beings and a robot type like creature, was that the actual site would be totally investigated by someone within the military. They would go back to the site and change and retrieve as much of the crash debris or any evidence. And this is what we found consistent. In the case of Koyame, we did find a wreckage of an airplane out in the desert. But then again, we're not sure if it's really that airplane. We were hearing stories that it could have been a gentleman that was smuggling drugs that crashed his plane in that area, and it could be that. It's not very often you find an airplane crashed in the desert, but that was really good. That was really an eye-opener for us, because it helped us realize and helped us. We were holding something physical there, and that told us that perhaps there might be another plane wreckage, possibly. But it's a big desert, and and of course with the situation in Mexico, with the whole drug cartel situation right now, and although I think it is getting a little better, but it sort of has put a little hamper on our efforts. But we rely a lot on our Mexican researchers to share with us what's going on as well.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating, and I guess also one of the factors is that whatever these crash retrieval teams, whoever they are and wherever they're coming from, they get there very quickly. So somehow something happens, they know about it. They know about it immediately, and they're there quickly, which, again, objectively, you're thinking, well, maybe these teams are all over the world, so wherever it happens, they're always fairly close to wherever it could happen, because they want to get there before any of the population has a chance to mull around the area and pick up stuff and whatever. I'm assuming, again, this is all assumption, but
it's true, because in the fact that although they are more focused on the national security, so let's say if it's a Russian or a Chinese satellite that crashes, immediately they're going to try to retrieve that. And so we're finding that, of course, that's been the explanation, where in Mexico back in the late 40s and into the 60s, there were missiles being launched from the Southwest United States, and these missiles would veer off course and crash into Mexico. And there were at least 4 incidents of that, and we realized that could be also a cover-up. And we actually did find that happen when we did an episode with the UFO hunters, where we went into Mexico, and there was space debris that was the result of an object that crashed in a particular village. But what we found out was how quickly that space debris was retrieved, and there was no doubt it said "Made in USA."
Oh wow!
And,
okay.
And the fact how quickly the military, the police, and the Mexico's Pentagon work very closely with the U.S. authorities to come and retrieve that. So if it is a UFO, many times it may be, hey, this is one of our satellites that may have crashed, per se, and they'll use that as a cover. Possibly. Right. That's our thought.
Right. And I have a question for you that I think is a perfect question for you, considering the research you've done and the amount of research you've done in this area. So over the years, doing all this research and writing books about all of these crash sites and the nature of how that plays out, how has it changed you, and where are you now with your paradigm on that? So, and then that's part one. Answer part one, then I have a fun part two of that question.
Oh, well, I think that um, it tells me how much I don't know and how much there's still a lot more work that we need to do. And although we're limited because of funds or time and that, but I'm hoping that the amount of connections that we're making, also hopefully if we do any more expeditions or any travels, that we can connect with these particular people. And I think that we'll probably may have some more answers. Uh, then again, it may just come out of a whole different situation where we may get a witness or somebody who's listening to a radio show to say, "Hey, Ruben, I have a lot more to share with you." And maybe later at another time that I could come back on your show, I'll like to share with you some other really interesting items I think you're going to find fascinating.
Great. Yeah, I know we weren't going to be able to get to all of it, but
Yeah.
absolutely would love to have you back.
Yeah, I'll leave you with a teaser, but go ahead and finish your second question, and then toward the end when you're ready when we finish up the program, I have a teaser for you.
Okay. I want you to put yourself on the other side of the equation. Let's say imagine yourself as being part of one of these crash retrieval teams. Let's assume they exist. Let's assume that they do what they do. Okay. Now, I'm not sure how people get onto those teams. Again, psychological profiles, clearance levels, top secret clearance levels. You're in the military. You're told that you're going to be a part of this team. You sign whatever you have to. You sign your life away, saying you will never talk about these things. Otherwise, you're either going to be in Leavenworth or worse. So you know what's at stake. You go to these sites. You start doing the work, and there's some satellites. There's maybe a Chinese satellite, and then all of a sudden, there might be experimental aircraft from the United States that crashes. And then one day, you actually go to a site and it's an extraterrestrial crash, a vehicle that has crashed, and you see firsthand, right up close, maybe alien bodies. Certainly, it's obvious what it is. How do you think, A, how would you react to that? And B, if you were on that side of the equation, would you be okay with looking at it as, I know this, I'm going to take it to my grave with me, and maybe it's a different perspective of, I don't need to share it with the world. It's probably not even a good idea that I share it with the world. How would you react to that?
We do have a chapter in our book, in Mexico's Roswell, where we had Elaine Douglas, who was a former state Utah director, and she had also been involved with MIT and military affairs. And we, in our interview with her, she did share with us where she was approached by someone that was involved in crash retrievals, and she noted how precarious their situation is. It's like the SEALs teams, for example. You may get called away to take care of a situation on the other side of the world. You never know until you're briefed. And so it's the same analogy. I'm sure that these guys try to wear and wear all the protective clothing that they have, and they're going into a situation, but they're realizing that they are dealing with strange alien technology. And we've also have interviewed several people that shared with us briefly that you don't really realize the danger that you have. You could touch something, and all of a sudden that one of your teammates could die immediately. It's like touching it gives you an electric shock and you weren't aware of it. Or there might be some other exposure that you're not totally aware of. This is one of the reasons why these guys go through a lot of decontamination procedures, which is different than what we're realizing in many of the third world countries, where their military and police forces will go to a site, but they're not taking they may not have the protection immediately at their realm. So I think that that would be one hell of a stressful situation. I'm sure that hopefully someday we may know through someone who's been on that other side that could tell us exactly. Who knows? The amount of red tape and the amount of other people there that are totally involved in that. What an extraordinary story that would be. And I'm sure there are people that have done that already that shared gives a little glimpse of that reality.
Yeah, and I asked that question because is it a blessing or a curse? We spend all of our time trying to find out what it is. What about the people who know what it is or what they are or whatever? And there's a burden there's certainly a burden that comes with it when it's that kept from everyone else and only a handful of people know. Yeah. So obviously there's a burden that comes with that. And I guarantee you that a lot of these guys had a lot of stress issues, anxiety issues, having to keep secrets like that their whole lives. I'm going back to the 40s and 50s.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
No, go ahead.
I'm sure there's a number of other researchers out there that can definitely give you their point of view and that had perhaps more interaction than I have. But the fact that it is, you mentioned earlier, it's the human experience. It's not just the UFO. It's how it affects people in general, and how it affects people from all levels. When something extraordinary has happened and it's impacted them, and for the rest of their lives. Right.
Oh, that's interesting. So what's the teaser? You said yeah.
Well, yeah. Next time when you have me on, I don't know if you could see this.
I can see that. Wow. Yes.
Okay. Footprint of possibly of a chupacabra.
I was going to say it's very interesting.
It's a researcher from Virgilio Ochoa from Miami, actually from Florida. This was in your state. Did an investigation, and he had told me briefly about it, and he gave me this little plaster of Paris of it. So the next time when you have me on board, I like to also not only share with you this particular story, but one of the fascinating cases that I came across in relation to the chupacabra in Mexico. Totally different than what you're hearing today that we're receiving.
Interesting. I was thinking it was the red eyes and the horns might have been their chupacabra, but I guess it's different. I mean, again, right? I mean,
who knows? Yeah.
That's interesting. So, and again, we're not going to get into that now, but that looks like I don't know the difference between a mountain lion footprint or whatever, but it does look interesting.
I went to a animal reserve, and I went in there and I did ask the forest rangers, or I asked them. They're specialists because they do track different animals, and you can buy books and give you the footprints of the different types of animals. And I just said, hey, this friend of mine caught this. I'm not sure what it is. Can you tell me? I wasn't going to tell him, and he said, well, it looks like a dog, but it's not. Looks like a puma, but it's not. so who knows what? He could give me the detail on that, but it's quite fascinating. So, and this thing is just, imagine this thing standing on its legs if it was. And I came across a whole chupacabra situation in 1994, Jack, in Puerto Rico. I was there right when the phenomena was really kicking into gear, and so maybe at another time, have me back, and I'll share that experience.
Absolutely. No, this has been great. One quick final question for you. Please tell everyone, these books sound fascinating. I want to read these books because I love that particular area of research in ufology, the whole idea of these crash sites and crash retrievals and these things that are, and also to the things that are happening in Mexico. Can you tell our listeners where they can go to find these books and where they can go to find anything else of your research, or if you have any websites, and then also tell us what you're working on right now.
Yes, just go to our website, roswellbooks.com, and you'll see the various books that both Noe and I have worked together. Plus, Noe's also worked with other researchers on some very fascinating books as well. We've also have a number of conferences that we're putting together. We're working with the city of Presidio with our good friend Brad Newton, who is with the city of Presidio, and we're putting on a UFO conference, which will be held on October 24th and 25th. It's basically free to the public, but we can give you passes if you're interested. We can get you $10 value. Really a great show. We have Nick Pope that's going to be there, and we have a number of very interesting guests. And so, people who are interested in going, we hope to see them there. And it's going to be again right there in Presidio, which is only about an hour away from where the UFO crash had occurred on the other side of the Mexican border.
Oh, interesting. Great, Ruben. I can't thank you enough. Great information. I want to thank you for coming on the show, and I want to thank you for what you do, because this is important research. Not many people make the effort to travel like that and really put the amount of work that you've put into this over the years. But it's worthwhile, and I think that people can gain a better understanding of the phenomena. If not definitive answers, they can gain a lot more knowledge by reading what your information, reading your research and your book. So thanks again for spending time with us, and for sure we're going to have you back on. We'll talk about that footprint, and we'll talk about some of the other really interesting cases that you've been involved in.
Very good. Thank you very much for having me, Jack.
All right, Ruben, and we'll speak again soon. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Okay, you too.